We have many audiences online and offline. Thank you for your participation. I'm Cha Si-yoon, MC for today's session. Nice to meet you all. From now on, we'll begin the session, Impacts of COVID-19 on Migration Policies and its Implications for Inclusive Prosperity. I will introduce moderator for this session. Director of UNITAR Jeju International Training Center, Choi Hong-gi. He served as the Korean Permanent Mission to the United Nations in the New York, US, and he served as an ambassador for international security affairs and ambassador to Turkey. And floor is yours.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As introduced, I am Hong-gi Choi, the director of UNITAR CIFAL Jeju, Jeju International Training Center. Before we start, first of all, I'm very happy to moderate this session on the issue of migration in the context of COVID-19. Before we start, let me briefly introduce on today's session. With the onset of the COVID-19 outbreak, active human mobility of all kinds has been drastically reduced by various lockdown measures to contain the pandemic. This has rendered a significant impact on the livelihood of migrants and people on the move in various contexts. According to a wide range of reports on migration trends in the COVID-19 context, the pandemic has aggravated the socio-economic vulnerability of migrants in both origin and destination countries. Even before the pandemic, the challenges facing migrant populations to support themselves, their families, and their communities have been an issue far from solutions. Considering their economic contribution to both origin and destination countries, it is critical to design policy frameworks which take those populations into account for inclusive prosperity. Hopefully, various challenges and opportunities related to migration policies in the pandemic context will be discussed and addressed in our panel discussion. Before I give the floor to our speakers, let me briefly explain the modality or format that we are going to use for the panel discussion today. First, the time issue. All in all, 80 minutes have been given to us for the whole session. We'll have two presentations by two speakers on the topic. Each speaker will be given 15 minutes max for their presentations. And then two discussants will make contributions to facilitate our discussion. Maximum 7 minutes will be given to each discussant. Discussants can make some comments or raise some questions on what has been presented by the speakers. After we listen to all presentations and comments from the panelists, I'm thinking about having at least one round of discussions among speakers and discussants first, and then I'll open the floor to the audience for additional comments and questions. As we have only limited time, I strongly ask our speakers to be concise and make their best to complete the presentation within the time limit. Now, let me introduce our first speaker, Ms. Nari Shim. Ms. Shim currently serves as a Policy and Communication Officer at the International Organization for Migration in the Republic of Korea, where she focuses on public policy dialogue and raising awareness on migration. Her topic will be limited mobility, impacts of COVID-19 and the policy implications. Without further ado, let me invite Ms. Shim to make a presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the host for having me today in this valuable discussion. As we all have witnessed during the past year or so, challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic still continue to intensify, especially as a variant fast emerges. Today, I'll briefly talk about limited mobility caused by the COVID-19 and its impacts on migration and migrants in general. Okay. As of early this week, according to WHO, more than 177 million cases of COVID-19 globally, including more than 3.8 million deaths are being recorded. Across the Asia Pacific region, more than 37 million cases with 0.5 million deaths are recorded. More than 2.4 billion vaccine doses have been administered globally, as reported by the WHO. Though a vaccination is mostly taking place in the so-called global north, while global south, that includes many Asia Pacific countries, being unreachable. According to many experts, vaccines will be widely available by next year or the year after next year, until when subsequent impacts of COVID-19 related travel restrictions or human mobility restrictions might continue. So the COVID-19 pandemic decimated travels, our daily life travels, as well as business travels, and also severely curtailed labor migration, and also severely dampened the general movement of all kinds of all stripes, like from international students or to family reunifications. So far, IOM, as the UN Migration Agency, has been tracking the travel restrictions, border closures, and health-related requirements imposed by COVID-19 since the onset of the pandemic. Most countries introduce, as you can see, border restrictions or visa issuance to control the spread of the virus. As many of you already know, almost 70% of about 270 million migrants globally are labor migrants who seek for jobs. And they have been especially heavily impacted by these restrictions. So, on the supply side of the labor, some countries, including many Asian countries, suspended deployments to destinations like Korea affected by the pandemic. And conversely, at the same time, business closures and slowdowns in receiving countries led to reduced migrant labor demand. And in the business sector as well, commercial flight schedules, as you can see in the picture here, have also limited opportunities to travel even when other restrictions are not in place. According to the aviation industry researcher called Cerium, in May 2021, so last month, about 7,800 airlines were still in storage, which is half down from a peak of around 16,000 a year ago. So, talking about the border closure that was widely imposed, this shows IOM's point of entry monitoring. You can see this. IOM has been tracking more than 4,000 point of entries globally. Among these all, about 17% of entries are still partially operating. In Asia Pacific region, about a total of 675 point of entries in 39 countries have been assessed, and as of last week, 79 borders, which is equivalent to about 12%, still remain tightly restricted. For airports, um, for instance, about 107 out of 249 airports are fully operational, while the rest are fully closed or partially operational. So now you can find in the graph on the right hand side, there's a significant decrease in the number of labor migrants. Which is marked with orange color compared to the 2019 before COVID-19. For instance, in Korea, from March to June last year, the admission of E-category visas, which is mostly work visas, was about 16,000, which is about 80% fewer than the same period of 2019. Looking at specifically at the admission of professional workers with Korea's employment permit system, or EPS, entries from January up to August stood at about 5,600, which is mere 10% of the annual quota under the EPS scheme. And this is because the government has deferred the arrival of most workers with EPS. For Malaysia, last year, which is below in the graph, the country suspended the admission of foreign nationals in March last year, but gradually eased these restrictions for certain categories subject to specific individual authorization. But however, low-skilled or less skilled workers holding temporary employment passes, like domestic workers as well as those in agriculture, construction, manufacturing, or caregiving, and those are all remain suspended. But like you can see in Malaysia's case, countries are shifting gears from posing umbrella-like entry restrictions toward introducing conditions for entry, such as requiring medical requirements or quarantine measures. Here in these charts, yellow area represents authorized entry, while the red one representing the total restrictions. So as time goes by, you can see the red area is significantly decreasing, except for Asia, Pacific, and in Europe. And these regional differences over time reflect the different evolution phase of the COVID-19 pandemic in each geographical areas. Due to the overall mobility restrictions, both in and out of countries, a global economy literally plummeted last year. According to IMF, International Monetary Fund, the global economy is climbing out from the depths, and the recovery projection for this year looks quite robust with about 6%. But with the COVID-19 pandemic continuing to spread, many countries have slowed down reopening plan, and some are reinstating partial lockdowns to protect susceptible populations. And therefore, economic slowdown is impacting every household across every corner of the globe, as you can see. And some people lose jobs, wage suspended, and children not going to school, and some people feeling of isolation heightened, and this is happening everywhere. So it is especially noteworthy that COVID-19 is disproportionately impacting like by class, age, gender, or race. So people in vulnerable situations like migrants, refugees, unaccompanied children, or people with disabilities are more heavily impacted. And socioeconomic impacts posed on migrants is especially huge. Like many other average working people, migrants suffer from wage non-payment or job losses due to significantly contracted economy in receiving countries. And this has been translated into plunge in remittances. As you can see in the chart here, except for Pakistan and Bangladesh, most sending countries in Asia have experienced a minus growth in remittances between 2019 and 2020 last year. Then why not Pakistan and Bangladesh? Some economists explain that the cause as remittance transmission being diverted from the unofficial route to an official route due to the limited human mobility. This is quite ironic. And overall, the remittance inflows to Asia has been on a steady growth until last year, taking up about 42% of the global flows in global flows. And however, the World Bank estimates a decrease in remittances of around 7.4% for Asia due to COVID-19. Globally, please see below the chart. Globally, remittances has shown a upward trend until 2020, and it dropped to about 666 billion US dollars, while Asia Pacific dropped to 281 billion dollars. The top 5 recipients in this region are India, China, the Philippines, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and those 5 countries collectively account for about over 3/4 of the total inflow into the Asia Pacific region, and at the same time taking about 1/3 of remittances inflows worldwide, and this is really huge. And you can see the total remittances of these 5 countries have also shrunk. Please, if you see the last bar graph. In the meantime, I'd like to also add that country like Nepal, of which remittances take up about 20% of the nation's total GDP, is especially suffering nowadays. Initially, the World Bank projected that international remittances would suffer a very severe decline, falling about 20% in 2020, but well, whether it's fortunate or not, for now it turned out that remittances might be more resilient than expected. Going back to the previous one again, other than remittances overall contraction, migrants are also experiencing degraded working conditions and more frequently being exposed to human rights violations as well. And of course, limited access to vaccination as well as to social safety net during the pandemic is a household name, a household word for migrants, and they also suffer from xenophobia or stigmatization largely due to misinformation. So now, after a year and a half, we're all striving to go back to normal. If COVID-19 has taught us any lessons when it comes to migration policy, some of them will be like these. First, virus does not discriminate based on nationality, race, nor immigration status, meaning that there's no ground for discrimination against migrants in tackling the virus. And second, border closure lockdowns does not bring explicit benefit in containing the virus. And third, mobility restriction hits harder people in vulnerable situations like migrants. And fourth, lastly but not least, COVID-19 has highlighted contributions that migrants bring to the receiving countries, but not recognized enough so far. And they are, as you can see, They are delivery drivers, construction workers, caregivers, nannies, cooks, and farm workers that need the fabric of our community. So in this respect, many countries in Asia Pacific region have made clear their intention to guarantee equitable access to vaccine rollouts as well as to tests and then treatments for anyone living in the country, including migrants in irregular status. And some countries are temporarily regularizing migrants to guarantee social and health benefits, and others are also preventing health authorities from sharing the patient's data with immigration enforcement during the pandemic response to protect those people against the risk of being deported. Even with these quite encouraging policy developments, it's equally true that there's still many migrants experiencing discrimination in all throughout these process and respective policy implementation. So I'd like to conclude by citing IOM Director General's comment emphasizing inclusive policy approach to overcome the challenges posed by COVID-19. Migration is interconnected with sustainable development at many levels, and it is clear that without incorporating migrants and migration in all planning and programming, we cannot recover them from COVID-19 and achieve the 2030 agenda, which is a globally shared blueprint for peace and prosperity. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Ms. Narishim, for making such an informative presentations. The statistical figures in the presentation are quite conducive to understanding how COVID-19 has affected the mobility of migrant populations. One thing for sure is that the pandemic does not discriminate anybody, and the migrants and people on the move face the same health threat as host population. Considering unfavorable situations facing migrants in origin, transit, and destination countries, it is true that the pandemic hit them harder and they find themselves in more vulnerable conditions. For the sake of time saving, I'll give the floor to our second speaker now. Our second speaker, Dr. Pia Oberoi, will join us through online. Dr. Oberoi is Senior Advisor on Migration and Human Rights for the Asian Pacific region, based in the Bangkok office of the United Nations Human Rights Office. She is responsible for developing and implementing research and policy on migration and human rights in the region. She will talk about key considerations in designing and implementing rights-based migration-sensitive policies. Dr. Oberoi, the floor is yours. Audio, I think. Dr. Oberoi, we cannot hear you. Just a moment, please.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Is that better?
Much better, yes.
Okay,
Please.
I have a bit of a sound coming back, but we can continue.
Just a moment.
Okay.
Can we improve this sound?
If you can hear me, that's fine. So I was going to say that I'm very sorry that I cannot be with you in person today. And to me, it really is a testament to what we have just been speaking about, that the mobility in the world indeed is limited. For us, I'm based here in Thailand, and it really hasn't been very possible to travel outside for nearly 2 years now. And I always say that this experience maybe gives some of us the sense of what it is like to be a migrant in an irregular situation, or somebody that is vulnerable, a migrant that is in a vulnerable situation. Because the borders really became a reality for many of us in the COVID era, at a time maybe when many of us were used to traveling quite frequently. In fact, what COVID has taught us is that borders are real. Some of us have only been able to see our families over Zoom or Skype for 2 years. This is a reality for many migrants, even before COVID. The fact that mobility is a precarious resource is something that we have now learned, I think, many of us. And it's a good lesson to take away. So what I wanted to talk to you about today is, as you said, Mr. Chair, key considerations in designing and implementing rights-based migration-sensitive policies. And I should say from the outset that what I'm trying to do is bring a human rights perspective. I work for the United Nations Human Rights Office, where I've been focusing on migration for a number of years now, and particularly looking for the last 2 years at the Asia Pacific region. So I wanted to bring the perspective of the migrants, the rights holders, into our discussion today. So I'll start and really complement, I hope, the presentation from our previous speaker. First, really to dive a little bit more into who is on the move in this context. Who are we talking about? Who are the people? What human rights are relevant to migration? There, I think it's important in order to design policies, because obviously policies being designed by states that are the duty bearers. How do they implement their obligations in the context of migration policy? And then really try to look at the importance. Why should we apply a rights-based approach to migration governance? And again, I think that the experience of COVID has taught us that the importance of putting in place policies that respond to the circumstances of the individual. And I just wanted to stop first to think a little bit about some of the issues that were raised by the previous speaker as well, about the particularities of migration in the region, which is that there's a number of kind of very complex and interconnected drivers, and as well migration routes. So you heard a bit about the labor migration routes, for instance, where you have recognized and professionalized migration routes for. But you also have a number of less formal routes where irregular migration and indeed mixed migration is prevalent. And later in the session, I want to look very quickly at the concept of migrants in vulnerable situations, because I think, again, from a human rights perspective, this is where we want to shine a little bit of light. But also, I think the reality is that the formalized, the temporary labor migration pathways that we kind of talk about, and a lot of the so a lot of the analysis and the statistics that were presented, for instance, are about these temporary labor migration pathways. They themselves can have serious human rights deficits. I mean, if we're thinking about how migrants and their families are traveling in these ways, they tend to, as we heard in the context of Malaysia, for instance, where you don't have the same rights as even other migrants, where it's divided based on the sector that you're working in, or these kind of fuzzy notions of what is low skilled and what is high skilled. So I think that there's again an issue in relation to some of these. Again, as was mentioned, in the context of the migration governance in Asia Pacific, we have some very challenging public narratives on migration and on migrants. We have a quite a exclusionary narrative in some cases, and that can tend to be, again, mediated by if we're talking about low-skilled migrants, or if we're talking about particular nationalities or ethnicities of migrants, if we're talking about the sectors within which migrants work, or, as I said, countries which they come from, which can be very exclusionary. And in fact, that these narratives themselves then tend to drive policy. So governments will kind of listen to their publics and say, well, we cannot grant more rights to people because our publics are scared of them, or they're fearful of them, or they think that they will take their jobs, etc. So there's a bit of a circularity in the argument there, and that can be challenging for human rights migration policies. And then, finally, as we heard again from the last speaker, that there have been the COVID-19 pandemic, I always say, revealed certain structural gaps that weren't created necessarily. Some aspects were when we have these border closures, and we understand, for instance, here in Thailand, where we have a large number of migrant workers that would rely on going across the border to renew their paperwork and their visas and come back. So that was a recognized kind of policy mechanism of regularization, and the way that the system works. So when you have a border closure, then these people almost immediately enter into an irregular situation. But and that was specific, I think, in a little way to COVID. But otherwise, I think we're really seeing that these structural gaps have been long-standing. They revealed a reliance on migration governance policies in the region that had kind of quite specific human rights deficits. And the response measures as well to COVID, such as, again, in some countries where you had migrant workers confined to their dormitories or confined to their living spaces for really months on end. It almost became like detention. You had migrant workers that were being placed in quarantine, kind of very far away from their workplaces, very far away from their ability to access public services. You had a rise in xenophobia and disinformation. So I think that there was the structural gaps in governance are not new, but I think they showed a light on where we need to change some of the existing governance practices. So just to come back to why people move, and I just wanted to make this point because there's often this idea, well, there's only one way that people move. They move because they lack opportunity at home, so they find a job and then they go. And that's indeed a reason for people to move. But we have in this region, I think, the whole range of drivers that can compel people to move, from poverty and things like food insecurity, from issues around, and we have movement of refugees, obviously, where we have war, conflict, persecution, discrimination, which cause forced movement. But we also have issues such as climate change, which is not classified in a sense at the moment now, because we kind of don't know how to understand this movement, and whether we should kind of be seeing it as something that is forced or compelled, particularly when it's a slow onset climate movement. How do we understand it? What do we mean about the protections for people when they move? Even when we're looking at livelihood and economic opportunity, I think when we see that movement in search of economic opportunity is pushed by people that are living in extreme poverty or in extreme food insecurity, then I think we have to look at it in a different way than if we're looking at the movement of people like me, for instance, that may move to another country for an economic or career opportunity. But I also have the option to stay at home if I want to, whereas a lot of people don't. And of course, we have things like family reunification. So if we're looking at the context of the best interest of the child, for instance, and I come back to these temporary labor migration programs where the ability of fathers and mothers to see their children for years on end is officially curtailed by these kind of temporary migration, labor migration policies. We really do need to think about the human rights basis of these policies. So just to say that, as I said from the beginning of my short presentation, what I'd like to focus on is the fact that obviously all of us have human rights. and everybody that's involved in the context of migration has human rights. So the policymaker, obviously the immigration official, you and me, everybody has rights. But the focus, as you know, of the human rights framework is on vulnerability and marginalization. So you have the human rights conventions here, and as you know, they cover basically the whole range of human of human experience. And while we have a particular convention on the rights of migrant workers and members of their family, this is an instrument that is not widely ratified. And I always say that in a way, it doesn't really matter. We do continue to encourage member states to ratify this convention. But almost every single one of the core international human rights instruments is relevant to migrants and gives tools to the member states to operationalize the obligation in policy. So they're not just kind of aspirational statements of moral or ethical consideration, but they really are as well ways in which policymakers can kind of take the guidance from the human rights framework and very specifically, very concretely put them into the policies that they're making. And one of these policies that I wanted to talk about as a new development in government is, of course, the Global Compact for Migration. Now, intergovernmental cooperation on migration, particularly in our region, in the Asia Pacific, is often contested and fragmented. But I think that the Global Compact offers an opportunity to improve this coordination across borders, to improve the rights-based cooperation with the attention to risk and vulnerability, because of the way that it is has been put together. Now, it's not a human rights instrument. It is not a binding instrument either, but it is based very clearly and explicitly on international standards, and it is clearly and explicitly under the auspices of the UN, with concrete actions that states can put into place, and a 360-degree vision of migration governance. And that for us is important because it brings in the human rights perspective, and it says to states as they go about trying to devise and decide what their migration policy should be, that it's not just about remittance transfer. Remittance transfer is very important. It's not just about family reunification platforms. Family reunification is important. It's not just about how you deal with irregular migrants and avoiding detention of them, for instance. That's important. But it's really looking at the whole range of it. And I think that's what we've missed for a long time in the context of migration governance, is for governments as well within their own planning on migration to say, well, I need to talk to the Ministry of Child Welfare as much as I need to talk to the Ministry of Interior. I need to have a conversation that happens between my foreign affairs and my social protection, or I need to talk to local government as much as I need to talk to the police or in some cases the military in terms of developing it. So I think it really calls for what they call in the GCM a whole of government and a whole of society approach. And there was a chance in March this year to consider some of these aspects, and then we will have an international forum held in New York in 2022, next year. Before I finish, because I realize that I'm probably nearly up to finishing my time, I just wanted to, as I said, focus a little bit from the human rights perspective on the marginalized and the excluded, and looking at Objective 7 of the Global Compact for Migration, again, the tool, I think, that really should be the basis on which we're making migration policies now in light of national experience, where we have Objective 7 of the Global Compact for Migration that commits member states and the overwhelming majority of states in the Asia-Pacific region have endorsed the Global Compact for Migration. It commits states to respond to the needs of migrants who face situations of vulnerability. So really, it's kind of saying that yes, of course, all migrants have rights, but in devising policy, we do need to be particularly mindful of the situation of migrants who are vulnerable. And my office has produced a set of principles and guidelines, which I'll be happy to talk to you about later. But really just to try and understand, what does it mean, vulnerability? Because I think it's important to understand that through the GCM, and through the human rights framework, that migrants who are not refugees are also understood as being in need of protection. And there I think we do know that, because we know that, migrant workers suffer exploitation. We know that when people are in transit, there's an issue of abuse. But I think that in a lot of ways, we kind of often have this binary idea of refugees need protection, migrants are here to add economic value to our countries, and so we don't really need to protect. There is a link, obviously, to the drivers of migration. So vulnerability, for instance, can be caused, as I said, through the disaster and environmental factors, through people that have to leave endemic poverty or food insecurity, when they lack access to health or education in their home countries. I don't think that we can say that these movements are entirely voluntary. Now, they may not rise to the level of a refugee claim, but I think we do need to, and this has been recognized through the Global Compact on Migration, that we need to understand why people are moving, because with that vulnerability, that will follow them through their migration as they move. And that's when you have the issue of transit, because you have people that are, as they move, they are very vulnerable. So in this mixed migration, irregular migration. But also in destination, and we spoke with the earlier speaker about the lack of access to vaccines, for instance, the lack of access to testing and tracing for undocumented migrants, for instance. And it's a big issue now. And some governments are kind of being bold and taking the right public health decisions, I think, to say that everybody in my territory is going to have access to vaccines or testing and tracing. And other governments are not doing that. They are premising it on whether people have a legal status or are in fact not putting in place a firewall between an undocumented migrant and a health intervention. But also migrants can be, because of how they have to live or how they have to work, at higher risk of infection. And this is also a vulnerability that needs to be factored in when policy is being made. And finally, of course, as we know from the human rights perspective, if you have something that is inherent, an inherent part of you, or something that is personal to you, such as your health status or your disability status, but your age, your gender, your sexual orientation and gender identity, that puts you in a situation where you can be more vulnerable as you move. And so you have these situational and these personal aspects of how the person moves. And this is why, in the ultimate analysis, policy must be responsive to the individual. So I'll stop and I'll end with a couple of key messages. One is that the effective protection of the human rights of all migrants is essential to realize the promise of the SDG. And I think it's important to come back to that, because again, there tends to be these silos in how we understand policy making. And we say, well, migration policy is, in the end, it's a national security issue, or it's economic labor migration issue. And very separately from that, is all about development commitment and what we do in terms of ensuring our societies are developed. What the SDG agenda did, and I think that it made a very bold call, is to say that the commitment to leave no one behind really means leaving no one behind. So we don't leave anybody behind in our societies, which is where the human rights lens comes in, to say who lives in our societies, with migrants in our societies, how can we ensure? The second key message that I'd like to leave you with is that coherent, comprehensive, and rights-based migration governance is not just the right thing to do. It's also an effective thing to do. Because you can, this has been completely, it's a brilliant case study, the COVID situation we see. Because we see, as the Secretary General has said many times, that we are not safe, no one is safe until everyone is safe. And so really having that lens to say, is the most vulnerable migrant also included in your migration policies, is a way to ensure that everybody in the territory is safe. But it also ensures predictability. And I think this is one of the problems that we've had when we've had migration policy that is made on the basis of a discriminatory public rhetoric, or the need for a government to show that it's strong and it's tough, and the easiest way to do that is by targeting foreigners. Because then there is no predictability, neither for the migrants nor for the states. Because as we know, irregular movements are not stopped by states kind of closing borders. Yes, they're diverted and more people die and suffer, but they're not stopped. So coherent, comprehensive, and rights-based migration governance also ensures predictability and upholds the rule of law, which is again part of what we want to do in terms of ensuring that we have joined up and comprehensive migration policy. So I will stop there. Thank you very much again for your attention, and I just want to end by saying how sorry I am that I cannot join you in person, but I do look forward to being part of the Q&A if you have any questions. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'll hand back.
Thank you, Dr. Oberoi, for your inputs on migration governance from the perspective of human rights. Indeed, our rights-based approaches are critical to the migration policy making in line with the commitment to leave no one behind. Given the precarious situations facing most people on the move, especially those in irregular movement, they are easily exposed to multiple rights violations. As indicated in the presentation, Global Compact for Migration, GCM, is expected to play a key part in enhancing rights-based cooperation across borders with more attention to vulnerability. Now we have heard two presentations on the session topic. Next, I would like to invite our discussants to make key comments and or questions. We have two discussants today, Professor Byung-ha Lee and Dr. Chang-won Lee. Dr. Byung-ha Lee is a professor in the Department of International Relations at the University of Seoul. His research interests include comparative immigration policy, immigration integration, and global governance on migration and refugees. The other discussant, Dr. Chang-won Lee, is currently working as a senior policy researcher at the Migration Research and Training Center. His main interests are international migration, migration policy, racism, and then Korean diaspora. So would you start first, Professor Lee, and then Dr. Chang-won Lee will follow. Professor Lee, please.
네, 네, 저는 한국어로 토론.
I will speak in Korean. I'm professor of Seoul, University of Seoul, Lee Byung-ha. While preparing this discussion, I was worried about what I have to prepare. So I thought, how do I lead this discussion? So I will focus on policy. And international politics, since the World War II, the global order was based on embedded liberalism. Embedded liberalism has two factors. Externally, open system and multilateralism is pursued. Very openness is sought for, and shock from the openness and some changes from the openness in order to respond to those changes. The nation needs to come up with some measures to protect their own people, like implement some policies to protect the people. The important characteristics since the Cold War, how to cooperation can be difficult, but externally, who protects whom, and who will be the member of the community can be is considered. The 2 points I want to discuss is how domestically to create inclusive citizenship, and externally for prosperity, how the international community need to work together. That is my 2 points. Inclusive membership or inclusive citizenship, it was hit by COVID-19. As Simnari suggested, most nations are locking down, shutting down their border. And some scholars say that it is border-oriented measures, like virus is kind of trans-border. It is very uncertain existence. So some threaten from some external factor. So with this strategy, actually politicians, it is very easy measures, like turn the public to have attention to the outside. It could be a very important asset for politicians. Set some border and set some boundary, like dividing citizenship and non-citizenship and membership and non-citizenship, set very clear line between the two. That is some strategy by some politicians. And various groups, including migrants, they are subject to exclusion. So who are our citizenship? That kind of important question was raised. Vaccination, some quarantine measures in terms of that. The lines between citizenship and non-citizenship was drawn very clearly. It revealed the very serious issue and how our society could create more inclusive policies for migrants, or how do we create inclusive community. It is very important in the future. In this COVID-19 crisis, the role of local government is very important in migrant policy. In the past, local government was just implementing the policy set by the central government. But within this COVID-19 and pandemic era, the role of local government is becoming important. So how to pursue, what kind of policies we need to pursue need to be considered and discussed. And second point is about international cooperation.
이제 뭐 GC
And Mrs. Oberoi mentioned global compact migration and other international cooperative schemes. So I'd like to talk about international cooperation. So far, regarding the global governance on migration was scattered, but with the launch of GCM, the global migration sector had the very important turning point. But our future tasks include what Mrs. Oberoi mentioned, and also basically GCM is non-binding framework. So how are we going to overcome that nature of GCM as non-binding international framework? You mentioned the right-based migration policy, which is going to play an important role, but how are we going to encourage countries to adopt that system and put them into practice? So we need to come up with specific indicators or some monitoring methods. So we need to see whether the companies are faithfully monitoring, implementing GCM systems. So for example, we can implement a name and shame practice. So if we apply some legally binding frameworks, then some sending countries may not be willing to participate in the kind of scheme. So GCM could promote more inclusive prosperity in the international society, and what kind of specific role can that play? And GCM and SDG goals are very important, and it's important for GCM to be aligned with SDG goals.
immigrants or migrants and development are two interconnected issues, GCM and SDG, and they need to be they are interconnected with each other, and they need to supplement each other so that we can achieve inclusive prosperity for all. So with this, I will conclude my remarks.
For sharing some critical challenges facing migration policymakers for inclusive prosperity. I am also quite grateful that you have touched upon the active role of the local government in designing and implementing not only quarantine but also migration policies. At that, I hope we could talk later more, if time allows, about the challenges in the active engagement of local government and issues with the global compact for migration, like how to encourage the international community to comply with this non-legally binding cooperative framework. Thank you. Now, Dr. Changwon-lee, please.
안녕하세요. 저도 토론은 한국어로 진행하도록 하겠습니다.
I will speak in Korean. I'm Lee Chang-won, Senior Policy Researcher at Migration Research in the Training Center. And our center was established in 2019. Our center is focusing on the policy of migration. I have 4 important points. And the border needs to be opened. And as Oberoi said, universal human rights based policy is important, and about inequality and discrimination needs to be addressed by the policy. And about anti-migration, we have to also come up with some policies to change people's mind. And about the openness of border, Lee Pyung-ha explained very well. And I'm a sociologist, so I will talk about the social point. About the universal human rights, that is something that I want to focus on. The COVID-19 does not discriminate race and peoples. Actually, COVID-19 break down all the lines between people and class, and it requires us to work together to prevent the spread of COVID-19. So we realized that protecting all the people is very important together. Not only the economic crisis, but there are some people who are very vulnerable in society. As Oberoi said, nationality and the status of the legal status, actually we need to have some universal approaches. In Korea, when with the onset of COVID-19, we focused on some kind of citizenship policies. Actually, when we distribute face masks, the pharmacists check out their ID of citizenship, so foreigners couldn't get the face masks. And also, relief fund was distributed to only Korean people. And also, there were some discriminative policies against immigrants and migrants. So their policies were really criticized. And after that, some of correction was made. But the nationalities and legal status of migrants, the Korean government was focusing on that when implementing policies. But we changed it a little bit about the trend, and we brought some changes in policies. So we have to recognize the basic human rights that needs to be enjoyed by migrants as well. And also some rights needs to be guaranteed for immigrants and migrants. We need to think about that as well. With COVID-19, we have to recognize that migrants are all the same people who have the rights to have enjoyed their human rights. migrants and immigrants are very vulnerable situation. So structural gap and discriminations are some challenges the migrants facing. Because of COVID-19 and because of economic crisis derived from the COVID-19, we have some statistics suggesting that the migrants are those who lose jobs first. Even though they get jobs, they do not like enjoy or receive some social protection, social safety net about the insurance for employment. Actually, before these days, even there are some people who are having some benefits from the employment insurance. So the ratio is very low. And because of the lockdown of the border, some people who are living, like some migrants in Korea, cannot go back to their hometown, and also they cannot work in Korea because they lost their jobs because of COVID-19. So we have to strengthen some social safety net for them. And the last one is I want to focus on some awareness among the public. The public narrative is becoming very negative, and it causes some threats on migrants. And this kind of trend could be used as politically as well. So there could be some discrimination and xenophobia among the public. So we have to come up with some policies to address those discriminations. And also there are some calls to set some guidelines to find out the fake news, because some fake news cause some xenophobia or discrimination against migrants. And also there are some online users who are spreading some negative sentiments against migrants or immigrants. So the government needs to conduct a survey among the public, and they need to find out the real statistics results. And lastly, the xenophobia and discrimination against migrants or immigrants, actually it is causing some concerns. And among some, the cause of economic crisis is caused by migrants. Some people think like that. And also some policies only targeting for immigrants, we also should get away from those kind of approaches. And some policy provide some benefits only to migrants or immigrants, so it could cause some backfire from the public. If you are a migrant but you are rich in this country, then the policy need to take care of some like Korean people rather than immigrants in that regards. So I will wrap up my discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Chang Lee, for your resourceful inputs on the implication of COVID-19 on the inclusive society, with more focus on issues like human rights-based approaches and responses to structural inequality and discrimination facing migration populations in Korea in the context of COVID-19. As I stated in the beginning, I'll give the floor to our speakers to respond to the point raised by the discussants. Ms. Narisim, would you like to share your input first?
앞에서
So thank you very much, discussants, for your discussion. Actually, the perspective from the scholar of politics and the perspective from the expert in sociology were very well received through your discussion, and thank you very much for the food of thought. And I would like to add one more thing to your comments. The health of people. When we talk about immigration policy, you may understand the importance of the public health, the health for the people. If you look at European countries, they experienced a lot of backlash from the public regarding their immigration policy. So important thing is actually to get consensus or agreement from the public regarding the immigrant and migration policy. So what kind of options can we take? We need to reduce trials and errors. And regarding this, Korea has started the fourth basic framework policy on immigrants or foreigners. In implementing this policy, the important foundation is that we need to get resonance or agreement from the Korean people regarding the migrant policy. In this process, we need to deal with the issue of misinformation. We need to handle the hatred against the migrants. We can take efforts to solve this problem by getting the agreement and consensus from Korean people. And as Dr. Oberoi mentioned, GCM is the framework that emphasizes evidence-based policy making. So the first target is to create and implement evidence-based policy under GCM. Regarding this, especially when Korea comes up with policies, it is lack of efforts, and it needs to make more efforts to conduct evidence-based policy making and implementation. For example, in Korea, why are foreigners discriminated against in Korea? There's a misunderstanding about foreigners. In Korea, some people think that the foreigners are highly likely to commit crimes, or they think that foreigners, they give burden to our own economy. And some people also think that the foreigners or migrant workers in Korea, they only receive financial support or economic benefit from the country, and they don't make any contribution to our economy. That's the misunderstanding people have. So we need to correct such misunderstanding and misinformation. But Korea has been lack of efforts to correct such misinformation and misunderstanding. So it's not just the fault of the public regarding the migrant problems, but it's also the fault of the Korean government. So we need to adopt evidence and objective fact-based policy making and implementation. I'd like to emphasize this importance.
Now, Dr. Oberoi, would you make some comments?
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of points, and really thank you to the discussants for, I thought, a really interesting and timely observations about the issue. I think on the first point made by Professor Lee, absolutely the Global Compact for Migration needs to be made policy, needs to come into practice. It is not a binding instrument, but the government is able to take the obligations that they have under international human rights law, under different bodies of law, and create an action plan. And this is really what we hope that the governments will do going forward. A slightly bigger issue, I think, is the point raised by Dr. Changwon about what citizenship means. What does inclusive prosperity mean? How do we define inclusion in our society? And every time there is a crisis, if it's an economic crisis, if it's a security crisis like during conflict, or now if we see a public health crisis, of course, citizenship hardens. And this is our nature as human beings, I think, that we decide we are scared, we need to retreat into ourselves. Now, obviously, as we've discussed, for the case of COVID, this is not possible because we live in cultural societies anyway. We, in countries like Korea, which have a structural dependence on migrants, in countries in other parts of Asia where they have communities that live across the borders, let's say, that cross the borders every day. It's no longer possible for us to go back to an idea of society that is just one culture, that is just one ethnicity. So the idea that the Global Compact brings about the whole of society approach, and I really would like to stress this idea of local government as well, because as you said very rightly, Mr. Chair, local government has been the place where migrants have looked to for the solutions to their problems, because they live in these communities and the local government is the one that makes the change for them. But we really, in these whole of society approach is where I think we need to think about making the change. At the UN Human Rights Office, we've actually been doing some work recently in partnership with the private sector, with companies, to show a different vision of migration and minorities, actually, because I think a lot of the discrimination is against minority communities, even sometimes if they're citizens, they're not accepted as full citizens because they are too close to the migrants, etc. What we've learned, and with due respect to the colleague from IOM, is that the busting of myths doesn't work. You can tell a person if they've decided that the problem with their society is foreigners, just telling them the contributions that migrants make or the economic argument is not necessarily the thing that's going to change their minds. And I think if we need to work with those parts of society which are influential, like the private sector, like the companies, to say, how do we make a different vision of the world? How do we portray, let's say, Korean society in a way where the really loud voices, the companies, the local government, the trade unions, that we're coming together to say, this is an important thing for us. We need to change how we see the society, because the disinformation, as we know from social media, it's both very attractive to right-wing politicians, for instance, that use this to get advantage, but it also makes a lot of money. And so we've been working with companies to say, how do we change that narrative? And it's not something that's going to happen, as I said, in times of crisis. We retreat into a smaller vision of ourselves. So I think what we have to do is find the tools to combat that retreat into ourselves. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Oberoi, for your very insightful comments. Now, I would like to open the floor for the audience. Since we have only a few minutes left, so I want to receive just one or maximum 2 questions, please. First, introduce yourself briefly and specify to whom your question is directed.
Okay, so I am Assistant Professor Spencer at Pusan National University. I have a few of my students in Global Studies with me today here. Thank you so much. All of your presentations were amazing, and it really intersects with my own work a lot and with a lot of my classes on nationalism and migration, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm trying to keep this short. And it's hard to say because it's all intersecting across, so I'm just going to say whoever wants to answer or address this first. So there's a lot of intersections between the rise of nationalism and xenophobic narratives surrounding migrants transnationally. So basically it's the same story, it's just a different venue, whether we're talking the States or Hungary or any other venue we could point fingers at. But nationalist narratives are powerful, and they're really great for rallying people to support politicians. So what can we do as an international community to transform these narratives? Because we've talked a lot about maybe looking at policies within one specific context, but how can we transform those narratives into something much more constructive as an international community? Thank you.
Who want to volunteer to answer these questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I answer in Korean? The answer could be complicated, so I want to say in Korean.
A very important question. So we need to transform the public narrative from nationalism to international community-wide sentiment. We need to restrict the spread of phobia sentiment. We need to create positive narrative over the migrants. So how can we create internationally accepted narratives for that? In about 30 years, some years ago, I participated in a forum hosted by OECD. In that OECD forum, we talked about fake news and the spread of hatred sentiment. OECD talked with many nations about how we can respond to those problems. So in that session, I was one of the audience. Actually, I mentioned one thing that was mentioned from that OECD forum. We don't have much advanced methodology to deal with the fake news, but we need to provide media literacy education, especially when we hear some news, what is the source of the news and who wrote the news? We need to check such information accurately. That's part of the media literacy education. We need to teach people to distinguish fake news from the true, real one. So we had such discussion in the OECD forum. In that OECD forum, many professors made presentation and they mentioned that fake news has tremendous impact on our society. There was a test in a village in the UK. The residents in the village thought that there are many migrants in our village and they are threatening our local economy. And they compared the misinformation with the statistics provided by the US Statistics Office. And after looking at the statistics of the official statistical office, they realized that the migrants were rather making contribution to the local economy. But after the residents of that village heard the true fact from the statistical office, they didn't believe that. No, the statistical information is wrong information. That was the response. As such, fake news has tremendous impact, negative impact on people. So even if you have news from the true source, you are not likely to believe in that because that's also considered as the confirmed bias. So international community needs to create guidelines continuously and reinforce digital literacy education. And regarding media, we need to have international organizations set internationally accepted criteria.
For your answer, I guess Dr. Obre, I'm sorry because we almost exhausted our time given to us. So sorry.
I'm so sorry, our time is really limited. And it almost come to an end. This session comes to an end. So
more on current issues about where the migration policy and the governance should be headed. I thank you all speakers and discussants and the audience who have participated by both online and on-site for today's session. Finally, I thank Jejuporom for giving us this excellent opportunity to have a better understanding on the migration issues in the pandemic context. I wish everyone to have a wonderful time for the rest of the day. Thank you.
네, 지금까지 수고해주신 자장님.
moderators and speakers and discussants, please give them a big round of applause. the session comes to an end. And for the last 3 days, we have had a lot of sessions. And I hope we could meet again next year in a very good health. Thank you for participation.